we have a good number. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please stay tuned. We're going to start in 3 more minutes. Let's wait for a few more people to join so that we can dive into this exciting webinar. I particularly am very excited to dive in and learn more about sustainability and how that works and how it's applicable to startups and small and medium businesses. So stay tuned and thank you for tuning in. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're super excited to dive into this webinar. My name is Fiona Chiruja. I'll be your host for the day. We're looking forward to diving deep and learning more about how small and medium businesses can, effectively approach and attain sustainability. This conversation will be led by our experts for the day from Deloitte Ghana, Ms. Naa Atswei Koney and Andrew Ayamgha, who, Ms. Koney is a sustainability and ESG lawyer and strategist, and Andrew is an ESG and Sustainability Associate at Deloitte. We're really looking forward to, learning more. A few housekeeping rules or kind of disclaimers before, I hand it over to Ms. Koney. We're going to launch 2 polls in the course of the webinar, one which will be launching right now. Would like to learn more about, what sectors you're involved in, what interests you have, or knowledge you may have been privy to about sustainability or ESG. So please check that out and make sure to fill it in and engage with the poll. We'll also launch a question in the course of the webinar to learn more about your interest in it. We'll post the question in the chat box below. So feel free to either raise your hand to be unmuted to make your contribution live, or to send in your answers in the Q&A chat box that can be found at the bottom of your screens. Whether you're using a laptop or a mobile device, you'll be able to see that at the bottom of your screen. Thereafter, we will launch the final poll towards the end of the webinar, just to get a feel and feedback of, how you've liked the webinar and what you've learned. Would you recommend it? So I'll hand it over to Ms. Koney, who will introduce us and take it away for us. Ms. Koney, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to today's ESG webinar. So what Andrew and I essentially will be doing is we are going to look to provide context for whatever it is that we share with you. We're going to start off by looking at the history of sustainability in the different forms that it has presented in the past and how we got to where we are now. And then we'll look into what we can do in our various organizations to incorporate ESG in our operations and strategy. And what we're going to do when we get to that side is, because there's a lot more focus on much bigger businesses, we'll look at what pertains in such businesses and then how we can scale it down to meet the needs of a small and medium-sized enterprise. So I'm sure that it was going to be a very exciting and insightful session. And like Fiona said, feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and would also open the mic for questions in the course of the presentation. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who will take us through the first part, which is the introduction to sustainability and/or ESG, and then we can kickstart the conversation. Over to you, Andrew.
Hello, good morning, and welcome again to the introduction and approach to sustainability and ESG webinar by MEST Africa and Deloitte Ghana. Like Fiona rightly said, my name is Andrew. I'm an associate with the assurance department here at Deloitte, and I'm excited to be taking you through the introduction segment of the presentation. So we're going to start off with looking at a brief overview of the history of sustainability and how do we get to where we are today. Okay, so the word sustainability has become somewhat of a buzzword these days. We hear things like sustainable finance, sustainable agriculture, sustainable cities, and since the 1980s, we've had something known as sustainable development. But how did this concept evolve to what it is today? The concept of sustainability is said to have begun during the Industrial Revolution, but history records seem to suggest that there were discussions had about environmental degradation way before that era. As far back as 500 BC, ancient authors shared concerns of environmental degradation by humans and suggested less harmful practices. Although the word sustainability may not have been used, it's clear that there were discussions had about what we consider sustainable choices way back then. Moving on to the 17th century, although not as profound as it is today, there were signs of water and air pollution and also deforestation, mostly in Europe. But this let us move on to the Industrial Revolution, which came about with its own societal and technological advances. But then around this era, the world's population also had just hit 1 billion people. So it brought about an increase in discussions about overconsumption of natural resources. And just like the Industrial Revolution, years after the World War II, there were major environmental issues, and the conversation changed from a focus on pollution to a global concern about survival. One major event in this time period was the Great Smog of London in 1952, where the city of London was covered in smog, which is fog mixed with smoke from coal and air pollutants. So this raised a lot of awareness and concern amongst individuals, leading to what we may refer to as the sustainability boom in the 1970s to the 80s. So in the 1970s, sustainability accelerated globally, and the first Earth Day was held. There was also a rise in environmental activism by citizens. Also, the first UN conference on the effects of environmental degradation on the planet was held, where the victims of environmental degradation told politicians about their experience just to raise awareness on the issue of sustainability. So that brings us to the 1980s to modern day, which most people say shaped the concept of sustainability as we have it today. In 1987, the UN Brundtland Commission, which was a sub-organization of the UN, aimed at supporting countries in the pursuit of sustainability. So the UN Brundtland Commission published a paper in 1987 titled Our Common Future, which helped develop recommendations for sustainable development in various countries. So how did the UN Brundtland Commission define sustainability? And how are we approaching sustainability in the modern day? So here we see the UN Brundtland Commission for Sustainability or Sustainable Development. It states that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So what this means is pretty much we right now need to consider how our actions are affecting the environment and the natural resources on the planet to be able to provide for generations who come after us. This definition was set out in 1987, which was quite some time ago. But in between then, there have been a lot of activity and development in the sustainable space, notably some of which are since 1995, the UN has been holding the Conference of Parties meetings, which is the COP meetings, where member states come together to review their progress towards tackling climate change. So these meetings have been going on for a while, all the way back since 1997, and it was 1995, sorry. And it was through these meetings that some of the most prevalent climate agreements were reached, namely the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreements, which were legally binding treaties between member nations on how they will tackle and address global warming and climate change. In between that time as well, the United Nations also came up with the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. They were a set of 8 goals, mainly addressing issues from poverty to stopping the spread of AIDS and HIV, and promoting equal and accessible education for all. But in the period between 2000 and 2015, progress towards meeting the Millennium Development Goals were not uniform. Some countries made significant progress in achieving the goals, while others were not making as much progress. So in the year 2015, the Millennium Development Goals were revamped with the introduction of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the UN SDGs, which was a framework for improving the lives of population and mitigating the hazardous man-made effects of climate change. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are also a set of goals more than the Millennium Development Goals. There are 17 of these goals which address global challenges like climate change, inequality, peace and justice, affordable and equal education. So the UN is made up of sovereign nations, but then sustainability, or the concept of sustainability as we know it today, involves a lot of private sector participation or private sector players. So the question is, what is the role of the private sector in sustainable development? Our slide here is going to speak to that. So the private sector is said to be a main engine of economic development in various countries. They make use of natural resources and interact with the external environment, that's the society, providing them with goods and services. Also the private sector is said to be one of the largest contributors of environmental degradation through the exploitation of natural resources in the production and manufacturing of goods and services. So what role do they play in promoting sustainable development? Being one of the largest contributors to the environmental degradation, they had to be roped in and change the way we do business, as the way business is done. So the way business is done has evolved over the years, from mainly focusing on just economic benefits or maximizing profits. Businesses these days are being forced to consider the impacts of their operations on the environment and society, and are also being encouraged to foster social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and economic prosperity. So the private sector needs to make that push, or needs to make that contribution to attaining sustainable development. It's not just on the shoulders of the governments. The private sector plays a major role in contributing to sustainable development. So on the back of the importance of the private sector to sustainable development, we move on to what or who are guiding or bringing on board the private sector to take part in or to play their role in promoting sustainable development. So in 2004, the United Nations Global Compact, which was an initiative by major organizations where they track and keep record of commitments they've made towards sustainable development. The United Nations Global Compact in 2004 published a document called Who Cares When? So this document was prepared by the UN and some selected financial institutions who came together to develop recommendations and guiding principles to help them implement sustainable practices in brokerage and as well as asset management. So we then look at the definition of ESG. The International Finance Corporation, which is the IFC, which is one of the largest global development institutions, focused exclusively on the private sector and developing countries, defines ESG as a set of environmental, social, and governance factors considered by companies when managing their operations and investors when making their investments. So moving on to the next slide, considering these external forces and their push to drive the private sector to implement or incorporate sustainable practices in their operations, we are going to look at some driving forces that are also pushing the private sector to implement sustainable practices in their operations. So the first one we'll be looking at are regulatory requirements, which are probably one of the most prevalent these days. With more developed countries like the European Union and America already coming out with reporting requirements, mandatory reporting requirements for private sector organizations. So the EU has the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and then the US also has the SEC climate disclosures. But looking locally, we are also making, here in Africa, we're also making progress towards developing regulations for sustainability. Countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and also Ghana have come up with ESG guidelines by their stock exchanges to help guide companies in implementing and embedding ESG practices in their operations. Also, the central banks of these same countries have also developed their own sustainable banking principles to help guide the banks who are some of the main funders of the private sectors, to help guide the funds in allocating funds to these private organizations while they consider their sustainability efforts. So the next one we'll be looking at is clients and business partners. Some organizations may be forced to adopt or implement sustainable practices due to the kind of relationships or business partners they have. A good example is in the agri sector, where maybe you're exporting foodstuffs to some of these more developed economies we spoke of. Some businesses in those economies are reluctant to do businesses with organizations that do not implement or practice sustainability. So in order for businesses to form successful partnerships and also promote their relationships with their business partners, they may be compelled to demonstrate how they are implementing sustainability across their organization. Another driver of sustainability in the private sector is investors and funding options. So, like I mentioned in the previous slide, one example of investors is the IFC, who consider sustainability and ESG factors before giving out funds to businesses to carry out projects. Another notable funding body is the African Development Bank, who's also looking to promote sustainability and ESG across businesses. So we also require some sort of sustainability efforts before providing funds to organizations. And then we move on to society. Society these days considers what they consume. So you hear people say, I won't buy that because it's not sustainable, or I'm not going to patronize this company because they do not practice sustainable practices. This is also mostly seen or more seen in the developed economies. And although it's still gaining traction in Africa, there's still a lot of work or a lot of action to be done in regards to societal pressure in Africa. I mean, one example of the evidence of societal pressure in Ghana and Africa is, in recent news, we've been hearing a lot about how second-hand clothes are being dumped in Africa. And although it's not as huge as outside, we do see an uproar by some citizens about this. So we hope that with time and with more societal pressure, there will be better action. On sustainability issues. And finally, we'll be looking at industry standards and business competitiveness. So some organizations may not be necessarily compelled to implement sustainability by the regulators or clients or business partners, but may belong to international bodies or organizations who insist that their members embed ESG and sustainability practices into their operations. So a good example is the ICMM, which is the International Council on Mining and Metals, which encourages or compels its members to embed sustainable practices across their operations. So looking at the drivers of sustainability, we're going to move on and look at some examples under each pillar of ESG, which is the environment, social, and governance. So here we have a list of factors that organizations may consider when approaching ESG. Although this is not an exhaustive list, we've picked out factors that are common to various industries. So particular industries will have more or less or specific factors they consider. So under environment, we'll be looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions are basically the release of harmful gases that trap heat in the atmosphere of the Earth, leading to global warming and climate change. So organizations are expected to consider how much greenhouse gas they are emitting into the environment, as well as what they are doing to reduce those emissions or to cancel out those emissions. Another factor we're looking at is pollution, water, soil, air, noise pollution. So the various aspects of pollution would apply differently to different industries and sectors. So, for example, in the agricultural industry, water and soil pollution will be a major concern. Are they using harmful pesticides on the soil? Are they washing out their pesticides into the water? So businesses are being asked to consider how their operations negatively and positively impact the environment. So under social factors, one factor we're looking at is occupational health and safety. So our organizations providing their employees with safe working environments, health services, training on prevention of accidents, and it's also just not in terms of their employees. Also, are their operations or their actions carried out through the business harmful or dangerous to the society at large? So occupational health and safety is asking organizations to consider how harmful or dangerous their operations are on their employees and society at large. Another factor I'll be looking at will be supply chain traceability. So it's expected that organizations are able to track and identify goods throughout the entire supply chain. This is because if there's one aspect of your supply chain that is practicing unsustainable practices, you cannot say you're producing a good that is sustainable, because the the value chain of the product has gone through some unsustainable production methods or unsustainable processes. So supply chain traceability is asking organizations to keep track and to be able to identify the goods they produce throughout the entire supply chain, to make sure that no unsustainable practices or unsustainable processes are being carried out to produce the final product. And then under governance, we'll be looking at commitment to ESG, leadership, and culture. So commitment to ESG starts at the top. What this is saying is they expect sustainability and ESG matters to be taken seriously and be considered all the way from the board to management down to common floor staff, because showing commitment to ESG by top management will trickle down to other aspects of the organization and create a culture of sustainability. So yeah, commitment to ESG is pretty much asking organizations to set a tone of sustainability and practice sustainable practices all the way from the top of the organization. Another factor under governance I'm looking at is the disclosure and transparency. So governing bodies are expected to be transparent in their efforts and progress towards sustainability. They are expected to disclose what they are doing in achieving whatever sustainable targets they have set, and be open with stakeholders about the progress they've made or not made. So this gives some sort of accountability to the governing bodies of organizations. And in talking about disclosure and transparency, there have been several reporting standards and frameworks released over the past years to assist organizations properly report their sustainability efforts. So looking at this slide, we have a number of standards and frameworks, as well as rating organizations at the bottom. So yes, so frameworks are more of guiding principles for organizations. They set out like the structure of the reports being made, what should go into the reports, and answer bigger questions about sustainability and reporting, as opposed to standards, which are more technical and detailed and provide metrics to complement the frameworks. So standards and frameworks work hand in hand to provide organizations with information to implement and to report on their sustainability and ESG efforts. And although they may be referred to as reporting standards and help organizations at the final stage of their ESG journey to report their efforts. These standards and frameworks also provide organizations with guidelines and recommendations in implementing ESG and sustainability across their organization and in their strategies. So here we have a number of standards and frameworks like the GRI, SASB, IASB, the Integrated Reporting Framework. So there's been a lot of criticism about the number of standards and frameworks and how they can all come together to form a global baseline for organizations to report their sustainability efforts. So some of these reporting standards and frameworks have evolved over time and have now been subsumed into what is the IASB or the ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Board, to develop or come up with a global baseline of reporting for organizations. So the next slide is just an overview of how these various frameworks and standards have come together to support in the development of the ISSB reporting standards. So a number of frameworks and standards came together or supported the IFRS in developing a global baseline for organizations to report their sustainability and ESG efforts. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my segment, which is the introduction to sustainability and ESG. I'll be taking any questions the participants might have before we move on to the next session, which will be taken on by my colleague Naa. So we are open for any questions you may have before we move on to the next section. Thank you.
Hi everyone, please slide reminder.
Do we have any questions? You could raise your hand or you could put a question in the chat box. Okay, in the absence of any questions, we will move on to the second part of should I call them lessons of the webinar. So before we start the second part, we're going to, okay, I see that there's a question about the frameworks. So a number of the frameworks and standards have industry specific requirements, but yes, but whatever it is. So when you look at the GRI, for instance, the GRI will tell you the kind of information you should put in based on whichever industry you're coming from. The SASB also has industry specific standards, and we should note that SASB is now a part of the IFRS or IASB, which released the IFRS. So yes, it's industry specific because, like Andrew mentioned in his earlier presentation, when it comes to the various considerations, it's a matter of the risk your business poses or to the environment and society, or the other way around. So it's industry specific. So yes, so we can move on to the second part, which is approach to sustainability and ESG. Before we start the session full swing, we have a question for participants, and I'd like you to, in a maximum of 2 words, so you can even do 1 word if that works for you, answer the question that Fiona is going to put in the chat box. Okay, so it's already there. What motivates you to learn more about sustainability? So if you can take the next minute to answer the question. So yes, I'd ask that we all move to the chat box to share our thoughts on what motivates us to learn more about sustainability, especially for the 35% who answered that they were highly knowledgeable in sustainability and ESG, but have taken the time off to join us today for today's conversation. What motivates you to learn more about sustainability? Is it that the answers are not showing on my screen, or participants are unwilling to share with us? Okay, I think we are going to continue, but during the course of the presentation, if you're motivated to, please feel free to answer the question. So when it comes to approach to sustainability and ESG, we look at it through 4 lenses. So governance, and then governance, strategy, risk management, targets and metrics. So when it comes to governance, what we are essentially saying is, okay, before we would look into governance specifically, but what we are saying is who has been assigned the responsibility of ensuring that sustainability is being embedded in the business operations and strategy, and other considerations which we would look into further when we start looking at each of the items in detail. And then there's the question of strategy. What is guiding the business? How are you addressing all of the issues that you consider important in terms of your sustainability journey? And then risk management. Once you have identified those risks, how are you dealing with it? What systems and processes do you have in place to deal with those risks? And then finally, we look at the targets and metrics. What we're saying is we're not doing things in vacuum. You need to be able to say that at the beginning of my journey, I was at point A, but in the course of things, so I'm currently at point F with the aim of reaching point I within whatever period that you set for yourself. So we are going to move on to the individual, further examine all of these pillars individually. So when it comes to the issue of governance, what we are essentially saying is we need to identify people in the chain of command who are responsible, who direct and administer the business so that they are able to drive the sustainability or ESG agenda of the business. And also identify people with oversight responsibility over strategy, goal setting, and then relationship with external stakeholders who would come to understand how the nature of the role of external stakeholders in the whole conversation. And then also you want to keep an eye on things. You want to make sure that whatever it is that you have set for yourself, whatever aspiration you have set for yourself, you are actually on course to achieving it. So we're looking at monitoring and managing, and then also ensure overall accountability. So the question of governance, what is this about? What are we expecting for the governing body? So what we have tried to do is different standards and different frameworks have different requirements. You'd find some standards or frameworks that focus solely on angle one, and then you find some standards or frameworks that are looking at angle two, and you find some that are a mixture. But because we are not looking or we are not having this conversation through the lens of one specific standard or framework, we try to put everything together. So when it comes to the issue of the governing body, we can look at it from two different angles. So the first angle is your board equipped to do the work that it's supposed to do? So we are looking at qualification, we're looking at diversity, we are looking at board remuneration, we're looking at control environment, good stewardship. We're looking at regulatory compliance. We're looking at disclosure and transparency. So when it comes to the issue of board composition, what we are saying is we are not just appointing people to boards just because we know them, just because they're family, just because they're friends, but they actually have the skill to deliver, to make sure that all decisions that are taken on behalf of the company is done so prudently. So, for instance, if you are in you're running a farming business, agriculture, you're growing produce for sale, you'd want to bring somebody who has the skill, the necessary skills. So we are looking at production, we are looking at sales and marketing, we are looking at forging businesses, we are looking at creating systems that make sure that everything is running properly. So that if you bring somebody who has no skill, if you bring, for instance, a statistician, you should make sure that if you're appointing a statistician to your board, the statistician is knowledgeable and has skills. But the question is it skills that is useful to the aim and the nature of the business? So that is what when we talk about board composition, that's what we are talking about. And then the question of diversity and inclusion. So they are asking that, first of all, and we see a lot of that when we talk about diversity in our part of the world, there's that focus on gender, which is quite important. Even though it seems that that's what the focus is mainly on, it doesn't reduce its importance. But yes, we want to make sure that there's that gender diversity on the board. We want to make sure that there's the expertise, there's varied expertise, so that even if you're bringing in agri-economists, you're not bringing more agri-economists than you should, because there's supposed to be at least a board member with expertise to handle the different important or the different focuses of the business. And then when it comes to board remuneration too, you're looking at it in light of the profitability of the business. So you don't want to appoint people to the board who are there siphoning funds, paying themselves all sorts of bonuses, where to the detriment of, for instance, the shareholders, or to the detriment of the business, so that there's very little money left to run the business or to keep it going. And then when it comes to regulatory compliance too, the board is supposed to keep that extra eye on the business to make sure that they are complying with all requirements when it comes to the law. And you'd see that when it comes to what the disclosure and transparency, because part of the disclosures for some of the standards, for instance, the GRI, they would ask you whether you have been fined or whether you have been penalized for breaching any regulatory requirements for the business, so that at the end of the day, you'd want to make sure that the board is there and making sure that everybody who is responsible for whatever regulatory requirements that the business needs to comply with is doing so. And then the second angle is looking at the governing body being responsible for driving sustainability and ESG in the business. And Andrew made reference to that in his presentation when he said that that commitment from leadership level trickles down to the bottom and creates that culture and environment that promotes sustainability. And then also make sure that sustainability is fully embedded in the operations and strategy of the business. So the board has that oversight responsibility. And usually what would happen is, okay, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So that the board is also responsible for making sure that the proper goals are set in light of the nature of business and the ability of the business. And then also they're responsible for driving strategy, overall accountability from management. And then also they are responsible for making sure that the performance and progress of the business is being monitored constantly. So the question of why governance matters. So we're going to start with one, which looks at the board commitment. Where the board is properly equipped to handle first of all, the nature of the business, and then also to handle sustainability related matters. It inspires investor confidence. It increases interest in non-financial performance. So anybody who is looking at how well the business is doing, who is looking at how the progress of the business, is not going to focus solely on profits. It's not going to focus solely on money matters, but it's going to look at all of these things because they all have the potential to impact the profitability of a business in the long run. Because, for instance, let's say I'm going to go back to the agri sector once again. So if you're running a business and you're producing, you're growing produce for export, for instance, and you rely solely on rainwater as source of water for the purposes of irrigation, and climate due to the change in climate, what we're seeing, the effects of climate change, rainfall pattern is disrupted. It has that potential to impact your business in the long term. So the question is, whilst you may be making profit now, given how varied the rainfall pattern is, have you taken those things into consideration? So once the investor or external users of the information see all of these things being acknowledged or being handled at board level, they grow more, it inspires confidence, and then they know that yes, whatever it is they are looking at is a complete picture and shows an organization that is serious about its business. And leadership involvement also drives success. And once sustainability is driven by the board and steered by management, it makes it much easier to rally staff behind whatever goals that organization will set for itself. And it indirectly, invariably improves and strengthens external stakeholder relationships, because part of the process of sustainability and ESG requires that stakeholders, both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, are constantly engaged in whatever in strategy and operations, so that their views also matter. Because at the end of the day, they either belong to the category of people who are affected by they're affected by the negative environmental or positive environmental impact of the organization, or its positive or negative impact on society. So that stakeholder relationship is very important, and it's even manifests in some sectors, such as the mining sector, where there are times that you'd face protest from community because they haven't been fully engaged prior to the establishment of the mines, amongst other things. So the whole idea is constantly have that conversation, keep a line of communication open that will allow all of these stakeholders to have their voices heard. Because at the end of the day, like Andrew said, these organizations don't operate in the vacuum. They leverage on that environment and then society to be able to continue to remain profitable. And also, setting good governance structures in place have the potential to also create a positive work environment and culture for increased productivity, mainly because workers and employees are one of the important internal stakeholders when it comes to ESG in an organization. So once employee well-being is assured, once employee well-being is considered paramount to the strategy of a business, it encourages the workforce to go all out to make sure that the company continues to remain productive and profitable. And on the issue of social license to operate, it sort of feeds into the stakeholder relationship, because like in the same example I gave regarding the mining company applies. Because at the end of the day, if you are in an environment, in a community where you're operating and you don't have that goodwill, you haven't won over the community, you can face all sorts of challenges, including distraction to your property and being prevented from even moving your goods out, amongst other things. So when it comes to building effective governance structures, what should organizations be looking at? Should start off by having a clear definition of function and the accompanying consequences for breach. Because if you define the function for the board, for management and staff, and there are no consequences to breach, then it means that people can choose whether they comply, whether they are championing whatever it is, whatever responsibility that has been placed on their shoulders or not, without knowing very well that there's no consequence to not doing what they're expected to do. Also, you should have a clean chain of command. Once you have defined that you have clearly defined the functions for each of the parties, you should have a chain of command. You should define the hierarchy for escalating and managing sustainability and ESG issues. And then also, you should also have, you should establish accountability so that everybody knows that. So whether you are setting up periodic meetings for updates and all of that, so that level of accountability is there and seen and felt throughout the organization, because we'll come to learn how important accountability is. And then also you should develop effective and clear communication channels and methods. So whatever message relating to sustainability or ESG that you want to circulate, whether it's amongst the board, whether it's amongst management, whether it's amongst staff, whether it's amongst the internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, you should make sure that that channel of communication is effective and also clear. And then also we are looking at coherence and flexibility. What we are saying is whatever governance structure you have in place, it should not turn out to be a shackle. It should have that flexibility that allows constant involvement. And once you have that flexibility in place, it means that when things change, you don't spend so much time trying to react to changing circumstances. You have that room for growth. You have that room for evolution. So that's what we mean by coherence and flexibility. So that's it for governance. We are moving on to strategy. Before we move on to strategy, I mean, at the end of the session, we'll open the floor for questions. But if anybody has any question, we can take one or two questions before we move on to strategy. Okay, I see that there are questions in the chat box. Okay, I think so. The question, there's a question about carbon markets. We can address that at the end of the session. Rihia, please remind us at the end of the session to address the question on the carbon market. Okay, so it looks like the responses came in for when I asked why people were interested in learning more about sustainability. But let's okay. There's a comment from Rachel about elaborating more on social licenses. So like I said, businesses don't operate in a vacuum. They leverage or they benefit from the goodwill they enjoy with society. So what we're saying is, if you don't develop that relationship with society, so in some cases it will come in the form of CSR, that is the corporate social responsibility. If you don't develop that relationship with society where they feel that collective benefit from your existence as a business, it has the potential to impact you. So the extremity of the impact varies. So it could affect how much people are patronizing your business. It could affect the kind of resistance they would put in your way. So that's where I made reference to, okay, so apparently chat has been disabled. Fiona, can you please attend to that? So like I was saying, so if the extremity depends on a lot of factors, prevailing factors. So in some instances, you'd have people stealing from you, you'd have people destroying your machinery, destroying your produce. They would put all sorts of impediments in your way that will affect the ability of your business to run smoothly. Okay, so we're going to move on to strategy. So when it comes to the strategy conversation, what is sustainability, or what's a sustainability or ESG strategy? So the loose definition for that is a set of policies and in some cases procedures which outlines an organization's sustainability or ESG goals and how they intend to attain those goals. And it could be one document that addresses, all the germane issues or the issues that are critical to the organization, or the issues, sustainability and ESG issues that are critical to the organization, or to have individual or a series of individual policies that, when read together, will constitute the sustainability or ESG strategy. And would ask, what is the purpose of such a document? So it serves as a blueprint of framework and a compass. So blueprint or framework, so it tells you what's the aspirational goal of the business and what they want to do to attain the goal. When we come to metrics and targets, we'll see how those metrics and targets help the company in attaining whatever goal that they have set for themselves. And also it serves as a compass in the sense that it serves as a guide. So it points you towards your goal, so that at every given time when you are measuring, you're measuring your progress, you're measuring your performance, it keeps you, you measure it in light of that document, so that you know that you're constantly, you know whether you are moving towards your goal, and if you are veering off, how far off you have veered from whatever goal it is that you have contained in your sustainability or ESG strategy. And one thing that we all need to note is that every organization's sustainability journey is different. So you cannot take somebody's sustainability strategy and then try and apply it to yours. It doesn't work that way. And the reason why everybody's sustainability journey is different is largely rests on the issue of materiality. When it comes to ESG, like Andrew said, the list that we shared on what you could consider under E, under S, and under G is inexhaustive. So, and the extent to which each of these considerations may potentially impact a business is different for everybody. So at the end of the day, what standards and frameworks are asking is focus on the most important ones, prioritize, so that if the nature of your business doesn't, to a large extent, doesn't require that it doesn't raise issues of land rights. It doesn't raise issues of community engagement. It doesn't raise issues of resettlement, because you're not going to uproot a whole community. You don't want to have a strategy that is addressing issues relating to land rights or resettlements, because at the end of the day, it's not something that is impacts your business, or your business doesn't impact society in that manner. So at the end of the day, what you're expected to do is what we call the materiality assessment. So you're going to do an assessment that will help you identify and prioritize the E and S and G issues that are critical to the operations of your business. So that's where the uniqueness of everybody's ESG strategy and journey comes in. So we're going to look at why having a strategy matters. So it launches the business's sustainability or ESG journey, and it gets live. So you might be there, your organization might have the desire to integrate sustainability and ESG considerations in your operations, but then having that ideal sitting in your head doesn't help the organization. So once you put that down, you reduce it to writing, then it gets live to that desire, and then it sets the organization on course for long-term success, because like I said, it serves as a guide and a framework. So you constantly have that document that's sitting there reminding you of your commitment, and then reminding responsible parties of their mandates to make sure that the company succeeds in its ESG strategy. And then it also sends the signal to internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and regulators that this is the business that is looking to contributes to the sustainable development agenda and in the creation of a just and equitable society. And then it also shows, particularly to external stakeholders when it comes to investors and then potential business partners, it shows that this is a business that has considered all the possible impact, all the possible matters that could potentially impact the success of the business, so that whatever, when they put their foot out or they extend their hand to do business with you, they are confident that you're running a comprehensive business that has factored all of these issues into its strategy. How do you create an effective strategy? So first of all, you need to understand the organization's nature of business. You need to understand its mission, vision, organizational culture. And you do this through observation and stakeholder engagement, so that at the end of the day, you're not creating a strategy in the vacuum, but you're creating a strategy that aligns with and fits into the nature of business, as well as the mission and vision of the organization. That being said, in the course of understanding the business, you could realize that perhaps the business's mission and vision or culture flies in the face of sustainable development, flies in the face of sustainability. So then the business can take that opportunity to realign itself, and then to make sure that its nature of business, its way of doing things, feed into the global and collective goal of creating a just and equitable society. So once you have gone through that phase, the next thing is to choose whatever standard or framework that would apply. And this is usually influenced by the force driving the organization's sustainability or ESG adoption. And one thing that we should be mindful of, we might not have this occurring or applying to small and medium scale enterprises, but you see a lot of it in the much bigger businesses, so that you'd have more than one standard or framework applying. For example, let's say that, so in Ghana, I'm going to use Ghana as an example, because that's that's the terrain that I'm most familiar and most comfortable with. But let's say, for instance, so in Ghana, we have the Bank of Ghana Sustainable Banking Principles. So the central bank has issued a set of principles that are supposed to guide and regulate banks. And then the Ghana Stock Exchange has also released an ESG disclosure guidance manual. So in this case, that's on the regulator front. And there are some banks who are listed. So on that front alone, they have the Bank of Ghana Sustainable Banking Principles applying to them. And then they have the Ghana Stock Exchange guidance manual also applying to them. And it could even get bigger when you get to the point where that bank is doing business with an organization like IFC, and IFC is providing funds for them for onward lending. So then they are caught by the IFC performance standards. So this is one institution that is looking to answer to three different external stakeholders. So in that case, all their requirements will guide how you create your strategy, because you have to make sure that at the barest minimum you are meeting all of their basic requirements. Of course, nobody stops you from going above and beyond, but whatever it is, you have to meet the basic requirement. And then you move on to the next step, which is conduct and create. What are we conducting? What are we creating? So we are conducting the materiality assessment. I explained what materiality assessment was when we looked at the previous slide, so that you want to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, you are focusing on the things that are very critical and important to your business, based on the business's impact on the environment and society, and then also in some cases on the environment and society's impact on the business. And that is what we call the double materiality. There's some standards and frameworks that look at it only from one angle. How are you impacting society? How are you impacting the environment? And then there are some of them that also focus on how the environment and society are impacting your business. So, and then there are those that ask that you put the two together. So whilst you're looking at how you're impacting the society, how you're impacting the environment, you're also looking at how the environment and society are also impacting your business. And then you'd also look at what we call the boundaries and threshold assessment. So boundaries, what are we saying? For some businesses will have they deal with like so many people along their value chain or their supply chain. So the question is, which of them are you prioritizing? Because at the end of the day, there are some of them that the extent of engagement is so negligible. So that's why we're saying that you set thresholds, and all of these things are dependent on the size of the company. So that if you have a company that is dealing its engagements with third parties involve a lot of money, so that maybe they're looking at maybe a transaction. In one transaction, we're looking at maybe $100,000. It will be hard for you to say that they should extend their ESG strategy and ESG risk management to transactions that are of a $5,000 value. But then if you have a business that is looking at transactions up to $10,000, then $5,000 will be significant to them. So all of these things, you do have to look at the business on a case-by-case basis and the amount of money that is running through or flowing through the business. So that's where the boundaries and threshold assessment comes in. And then also we are looking at creating systems and processes that will make sure that all of that will give life to whatever your strategy is. I think that's somewhat self-explanatory. So we can move on to the next point, which is appoint or assign. So we say appoint or assign because depending on, once again, we're looking at how huge the company is. So the much bigger companies with the much bigger impact on environment and society will be required to appoint full-time sustainability managers. But businesses that, like I said, depending on the size, are quite relatively small, can look at an existing managerial role, taking on the additional responsibility of sustainability management. So it all depends, like I said, it goes back to the point that it's on a case-by-case basis. And then we move on to consulting and creating awareness. So the organization will not, in fact, any organization that sets to do its sustainability journey without external stakeholder consultation is failing, has already failed. Because the whole idea is you engaging people who are potentially impacted by what you're doing, to make sure that you are considering the impact in developing your strategy. So you'd have to consult relevant stakeholders, and once you have for their comments and drafts, and comments and inputs on the drafts before finalization. And then also you need to create that awareness, because human as we are, we need that buy-in. We need to feel like we have been a part of a process for us to be able to give life and take the strategy and run with it. But once we feel like it's being imposed on us, then it makes adoption very, very difficult for the organization. And then finally, we are looking at publishing. So depending on the nature of strategy, of course, you cannot publicize your full strategy, because it might speak to certain things that will constitute proprietary interests that you'd not want to share with the people you consider your competitors. But essentially what you're saying is you need to publicize that you have a strategy. So you can have a strategy that speaks to what your overall goal is without necessarily detailing how you intend to achieve the goal and all of that, but detail the overall goal. Let people know, so that at the end of the day, you have that, you know that you're accountable to a much wider community than to the internal organization. And then you also need that periodic staff engagements to ensure compliance, because it's your staff that will carry and run with it. So that if you have your board overseeing, it's the management, you're putting all sorts of processes in place, but they can't get the staff to buy into it and make sure that they run with it, because it's just, if you're a bank, for instance, you're a financial institution, it's the staff that will be dealing directly with the clients and customers. So they are the people who will be making sure that the overall strategy is being implemented at ground level. So you want to publish it, you want to have periodic staff engagement to even measure compliance, so that if you need to tweak it here and there, you have that living organism that you're constantly making sure that it's serving its purpose. So that's it for strategy. Do we have any questions before we move on to the next phase?
We do have Godwin, who has been having his hand up for some time. So
Godwin has raised his hand. Godwin, please go ahead and ask your question. I can't hear Godwin. I don't know if he's speaking. Can you confirm if Godwin is speaking?
He does have the permission to talk, so he needs to unmute to be able to make his contribution.
Okay. We have to run through the risk management and then the measures and targets, and we have just about 40 minutes to do that and take final questions. So we're going to move on. Anytime that Godwin is able to ask his question, he can type it in the chat box. Otherwise, he can wait till we are done with the session. So when it comes to the issue of risk management, in all of it, we need to look at it in light of the pillars of sustainability, or ESG, which is governance, social, and then environmental. So like we have said, you'd have to perform a materiality assessment to determine what is critical to the nature of business that you're doing and the community in which you operate. So that at the end of the day, whatever list you finalize, or based on your materiality assessment, you'd want to look at the risk, the potential risk to the business, or the potential risk of the business to the environment and then to society. So that's essentially what we are saying. So the question is we're looking at what to evaluate. So if you look at environment, for instance, Andrew mentioned, one of the things that he mentioned was greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions are quite a lot globally. We're looking at the major industries or sectors are responsible for the highest emissions are the waste management sector. We are looking at the extractive industry. We are looking at the extractive industry, particularly on the petroleum space, because fossil fuel is considered one of the highest emitters of greenhouse gases. And then we are also looking at deforestation or agriculture. So we can look at it separately and together. Separately in the sense that there are so many reasons why people cut down forest, and then together in the sense that there are times that people, due to bad farming practices, haven't found a sustainable way of reintroducing nutrients into existing farmland. So when produce is affected, or the ability of the soil to sustain plants is affected, then they just move on to and clear more forests just to keep their businesses going or businesses running. So all of those things contribute to these greenhouse gas emissions. So if, for instance, you're looking at a business like a mining business, for instance, and you are seeking to mine in a forest, so there's that question of is there a way you can go around removing vegetation? If not, what are you doing to manage the potential fallout, which includes biodiversity loss, because we know that when we enter a forest, it's not just about the trees. So we are looking at ecosystem losses, services loss, because the trees contribute to maintaining a certain climate or atmosphere. They contribute to rainfall. They contribute to, and there are so many things, medicinal purposes. Like there's so many things, the benefits we get from forest. So it's not just about the trees standing, but everything else that we get from it. So there's that question of what is that organization doing to deal with the risk that, or the potential fallout from removing such vegetation. So that's just an example under the environment dimension. So we are coming to why we are saying risk management is important. So once you have your governance, you have your strategy, why are we saying that risk management is also important? Because it provides structure, and it shows how beyond the please give me a moment. So it provides structure in the sense that it gives life to the organization's sustainability and ESG strategy. So you could have your strategy, you could say that I want to do this, I want to do that. But the question is, how are you going to do it? And how are you going to keep a constant eye on that impact, or that impact that risk poses to your organization, or your organization poses to the environment and society, or society. So it's the risk management process that gives you that avenue to handle the organization's ESG goals. And it also enhances the organization's performance, sustainability or ESG performance, because it provides the how, in how the organization adopts its sustainability and ESG, or integrates its sustainability and ESG into its operations. So beyond saying that I am going to, let's say, work towards eliminating child labor, maybe it's an organization that runs cocoa farms. And so it's saying that I am working towards eliminating child labor. So what is the process for assessing whether or not children are being employed to work on the farm to the detriment of their development? So all of these things matter, because at the end of the day, that's how you give life to your goals that you have put in your strategy. And then also provides insight into the organization's ability to deal with future potential or actual risks to their performance, and then also to their continuity, or their ability to keep running as a going concern. And once you are able to assess all of those risks, you are able to guard against it. So you can take steps so that if whatever risk you're looking at is something that is going to happen maybe 5 years from now, like, so you're forecasting, you're looking at, let's say, like the example I gave about the fertility of the soil, if you're a farm, so that you know that maybe there's that 5-year cycle, and then nutrients will be depleted. So you start planning towards it and working towards making sure that you don't get to that point where there's nutrient depletion, and then you essentially have to pause and start all over again. Once you are thinking about all of those things, you start working so maybe 3 years from that 5-year period, you start working towards reintroducing nutrients into the soil, so that you don't have to go and then clear more vegetation just to keep your business running. Or then so that you don't interrupt your supply process as well, because your business partners will take you more seriously if they know that you have factored all of those things into consideration, so that at every given time they can constantly rely on you being able to meet your contract's requirements. And then also the risk management process allows for integration. So once you have a robust environmental and sustainability and ESG risk management approach, it allows for seamless integration with the overall risk assessment process of the business. So that, first of all, you look at it in light of what is the risk management process, my sustainability and ESG, and then you take that additional step of how does it fit into the overall risk assessment process of the organization. So when it comes to risk management, we are saying, what are the benefits of having a sustainability or ESG risk management process in place? We are looking at improved regulatory compliance, because you constantly have your eyes on the regulatory requirements for the company, because you don't want to have to disclose at the end of your reporting year that, oh, so I was fined by the Revenue Authority because I wasn't tax compliant, or maybe I was fined by the Environmental Protection Agency because I didn't have the necessary systems in place to deal with noise pollution or air pollution, or and the likes. So once you know that you are being required to report on your fines or consequences of breach, it puts you on your toes, and so it improves regulatory compliance, which also feeds into an improvement in investment potential, because investors will be confident in what you're doing and know that this is a business that we can take seriously. And for all the reasons that we have previously mentioned, and then also there's that improved employee productivity that we have also previously referred to. And then which all feed into increased profitability, because proper planning through your risk management process allows the organization to properly allocate resources and then to re-strategize quickly to adjust to changing circumstances. And then we're looking at the what I think will be the final slide on risk, the risk management. We're looking at integrating ESG factors into risk management. How do you do it? So first of all, you have to define your goals, and then you must also have a clear sustainability and ESG risk process. And then also you embed your sustainability and ESG risk process in the overall risk process of the organization. You must collaborate amongst all internal stakeholders to make sure that they are complying with the risk management process and making sure that they are factoring the ESG and sustainability risk into how they are assessing the organization's risk. And then finally, you monitor. You have to periodically gather and analyze data on effectiveness and compliance, because it might be an effective system, but then compliance might be low. And then also, whilst people might want to comply, the level of effectiveness of the process makes things cumbersome. So you have to constantly keep that eye on things, just to make sure that, like I said, ESG is not meant to be shackles. It's supposed to be a guide and a tool in making sure that you're running sustainably, so that you have to constantly be open to the idea of evolving, open to the idea of constantly tweaking and moving pieces around, just to make sure that the overall goal of the strategy is achieved. We'll hold on to the questions, because I want to make sure that we discuss all the important things, and then we'll have room at the end of the session for questions. So targets and metrics. So we've seen the what, the how, and we're looking at the next question of so after you have your you set up the governance structure, you have drafted your strategy, you have put in your risk management process, you have done all of that. How do you know that you can sit and hit your chest and say that, yes, I have accomplished what I set out to do? The only way you can do that is to have your targets clearly spelled out, and then metrics in place for measuring the targets. So when we talk about sustainability and ESG targets, what do we mean? We mean the objectives established within a company as part of their process to full compliance with sustainability and ESG requirements. So these targets are usually determined by drivers of sustainability that we have referred to. So whether it's regulatory compliance, whether it's investors, whether it's business partners, whether it's society, whether it's industry competitiveness, and international best practices. So you set your targets based on that. You'd find that a lot of the extractive sector, both mining, metals, and as well as petroleum organizations, have this commitment to net zero, and they have net zero commitments by 2030. So what they are saying is that by 2030, they are going to make sure that the amount of greenhouse gases they are putting in the atmosphere is equal to what they are removing, so that there's this balance of net zero. So that constitutes a target. So yes, so that's one way. When we get to the metrics, I'll explain how the metrics feed into the example that I have just given. So the targets are usually based on the considerations that have been identified as material to the organization's nature of business or operations. So based on what I have said about the contribution of the extractive sector to greenhouse gas emissions, you can understand why they would have having such a target will be important to them, because they are the highest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So when it comes to the issue of metrics, what we are saying is we are looking at a range of non-financial performance indicators that is used to evaluate the company's sustainable and responsible practices, and is a means of assessing an organization's performance of its material, sustainability, and ESG considerations. And it allows you to quantify and enable measurement of progress. So on the issue of having the commitment to the net zero commitment. So what you're essentially saying is, perhaps in the past, you had a lot of your board members or management flying out for one reason or the other for business. So the next question is, can you consider holding your meetings virtually so that it cuts down on how much emissions, their carbon footprint? And then also look for more sustainable ways of transporting your goods. So in the past, if you have relied on modes of transportation that rely on fossil fuels, you can explore renewable energy sources. So you're looking at electric vehicles, you're looking at installing solar panels in your organization, so that all of those things will contribute to a reduction in the emissions of your business. A lot of the standards and frameworks encourage that businesses should first look at cutting their emissions before moving on to the next or available option, which is to offset their carbon. So that you look at external activities external to your business to offset whatever your carbon footprint is. So it will come in the form of investing in or contributing to reforestation, or contributing to climate mitigation or adaptation activities. So that's another way of measuring. So you can set that metric of maybe you're committing this amount of resource to setting off your carbon footprint so that you can meet the targets that you have set for yourself. So that's essentially what we're looking at when we talk about targets and metrics. So why are ESG metrics important? So it provides that tangible commitment. So beyond you saying that, oh, so I'm going to run a sustainable organization, I'm going to do this, I am going to make sure that I am not wasting, let's say, paper, for instance. So I'm going to do more electronic than physical printing. And then the question is beyond you saying that, what are your specific targets? So your target could be that cut by printing by 50% by the end of the financial year. So the metric will be more specific. So you're talking, so the target is cutting your printing, and the metric will be like measure how you are going to measure the amount of paper that you are buying, the amount of paper that you are using, and all of the and all of that. So once you have that metric, then it's more tangible. So that if you're running, so if in the you were using, let's say, 100 reams of paper in a year, you can say that by cutting in half, then you're saying that you're cutting it down to 50, so that you can measure. So the 50, I'm spreading it over. This is how I'm going to do it. This is what I'm going to be measuring. So that at the end of every month, you have a chart or an Excel sheet or whatever form that's, because there are some people who monitor the ESG or collect the ESG data digitally. So at the end of the day, you'd say you'd be able to measure and say that, okay, yeah, so I used one less ream of paper this month, I used 2 less. Oh, and in the third month, I went overboard by 2 more. So all of these things create that tangible commitment. And then measurements optimization. So the whole idea, what we're saying is, you can even tell whether the way in which, or the approach to measuring these ESG considerations are not leading you to that expected end. So they are not feeding into your overall target. So they are not effective in what they have been tasked to do. So once you have the metrics, it gives you the opportunity to start tweaking things around, just to make sure that it serves its purpose. And then when it comes to transparency of progress, what we are saying is, one of the reasons why you're doing all of this is to be able to say that at the beginning of my journey, I set out to do this. I set out to do this. And this is where I am, and this is what I have been able to achieve. This is where I am, and this is what I have been able to achieve. So when it comes to targets and metrics, what do you need to do when you're setting your ESG targets? So the first step is you need to conduct baseline studies, and I want to say that it goes without saying why conducting the baseline study is important, but I'm going to shed a bit of light. I'm choking. I'm going to shed a bit of light into that. So what we are essentially saying is, we are going to circle back to what I have said initially, that what I've said initially, sorry, that's a bit interesting. What I had said initially, that every organization's ESG journey is unique. So what are we doing? We are saying that look at your organization based on the materiality assessment that you did, and based on what you narrowed down as important or prioritized for your organization. Conduct a baseline assessment so that you know where you're starting from. So like I used the rim of paper as an example. So the baseline assessment is how many rims of paper were you using in a year in the past? So you can do an average, you can look back into the three years so that you make sure that whatever figure you're looking at is an average. You can account for special circumstances that may have led to, may have accounted for variations along the line. So once you have that, you have set that, you have conducted that baseline, you have conducted that baseline study, you know what you're looking at, or in what you are measuring against, and it allows you to move on to the next step, which is to set the SMART goals. So what are SMART goals? We are saying that the goal should be specific, it should be, the target should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, it should be relevant, and then it should be timely. So once you have all of those things going, because at the end of the day, we all understand these SMART goals, which we understand why it has to be specific, it has to be measurable, it has to be achievable, it has to be relevant, and it has to be timely. So that once we have all of these goals, we know that the next step is what we will do to make sure that we are meeting all of the goals that we have set. And then moves on to the third point, which is share goals across teams. So like we have been saying since the start of the session, the ESG, attaining your ESG goal it requires a lot of collaboration and input from everybody, a lot of people and everybody. So you need to share the goals so that everybody knows what they are working towards. And then monitor the progress to goals. So whilst you have done all of these things, you need to make sure that you are monitoring the progress to achieving these goals, because at the end of the day, you don't want to get to the end of the year before you realize that, oh, I was so far off, when maybe if you had been monitoring 3 months down the line, you'd know that, no, you need to step up your game so that you are able to fully comply with the goals that you have set for yourself. So when it comes to setting targets, we can look at the World Economic Forum example, which looks at it looks at the various SDGs. So the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals Andrew referred to when he handled his session. So these SDGs cover a lot of subject areas. So when it comes to setting your targets, you can look at these SDGs, for instance. So SDG 13 is on climate action. So an example of a goal on climate action would be to develop a net zero carbon emissions goal and implementation strategy by 2025, which will look at reducing your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions on absolute basis by 30%. When it comes to SDG 7, for instance, we're looking at affordable and clean energy. So your target could be to switch to a green tariff, purchase renewable energy, and then off-site power purchase agreements. So there are so many ways of achieving that. So that's an example under the SDG, the environment. And the social, you can look at good health and well-being. So you can provide a health benefits package to employees that exceed the national cross-industry benchmark. So what you're saying is, I don't know if you remember that I said that sometimes you can go above and beyond whatever your regulator is asking of you. But whatever it is, you need to meet a barest minimum. So this is an example of an organization that is looking to go above the barest minimum by making sure that their employees are well taken care of health-wise. And then also the same applies to decent work and economic growth, and then reduce inequalities. So a combination of SDG 8 and 10. So you can look at meeting or exceeding minimum living wage. So the question is, you should even ask yourself that what I'm paying, the minimum, the wage, the lowest wage I'm paying, is this something, given the economic circumstances? Because sometimes we are all aware that sometimes governments are slow to react, so that the government might have a minimum wage in place, but the question is this enough to keep a family going, an employee and their family going? What can I also do to make a difference? So that's where the targets come in. And then when it comes to governance, we can also look at the decent work and economic growth. And then that is looking at cutting business costs by 15% by 2030 through efficiency improvements. So these are ways that you can set targets, and based on the example from the World Economic Forum. When it comes to the targets and metrics, particularly the metrics, we can look at it through two lenses. We're looking at the qualitative and then the quantitative. So what the quantitative is saying is we are measuring based on numerical data, and it's capable of direct measurement. Capable of direct measurement. So you can measure. So for instance, we have examples. For instance, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, you'd look at the example I gave about traveling to attend meetings outside your jurisdiction, for instance. There are ways of measuring. So there are ascertainable ways of measuring. So you look at the distance, fuel efficiency, amongst other things, and then you can come by how much greenhouse gases your journey released into the atmosphere. And the same for electricity usage. There are ways of monitoring. There are ways of monitoring employee turnover rates, because we're looking at absolute figures at the end of the month, at the end of the year, how many of your employees exited, and then you can look into the reasons. So maybe the reasons will form parts of the qualitative metrics. And then when it comes to qualitative measures, we are looking at non-numerical data. That it's much harder to measure, and because it's based on some level of subjectivity. But it doesn't make it impossible to measure, because once you have parameters for measuring and you define those parameters, and those parameters are clear, it removes, to a large extent, removes that element of subjectivity from it, so that if you're looking at commitment to diversity and inclusion, you can create parameters, so that if your parameters include having that gender diverse board of 50-50 male female, that defined parameter sort of creates that or removes that level of subjectivity, because at the end of the day, then you can ask yourself the question of, did I achieve that or did I not achieve that? And then that will be considered to be a reflection of your commitment to diversity and inclusion. So we are coming back to how you can measure some of the examples of the metrics that we have referred to. So the greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, you are looking at levels of carbon dioxide, levels of methane. I avoided going into greenhouse because it's a whole full topic on its own. But then, so that we have the examples here represent the usual culprits when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to energy consumption, the metrics will be looking at kilowatts per hour, which is easily ascertainable because we buy our electricity from an external grid. So at the end of the day, your provider can tell you how much energy that you have used in that month. Same for water consumption. And then when it comes to nature usage, you have professionals who can tell you how much biodiversity has been lost, forest cover, and all of those things. And then when it comes to the social metrics, it's easy to ascertain living wage. It's easy to ascertain diversity based on percentage or even absolute figures. Easy to ascertain gender pay gap, and then etc. And then when it comes to the governance metrics, we are looking at, I'm sure, I don't know if we all recollect me saying that it's quite important that whatever the governing body is receiving, whatever management is receiving, it should be considered in light of the business and its profitability. So it's easy to measure pay ratio. It's easy to measure quality of governing body based on their outputs, amongst others. And how do you ensure data integrity? Because at the end of the day, if I am doing a self-assessment, I am doing self-monitoring. For the users of the information to have confidence in the data, how do we make sure that there's data integrity? So the options are third-party verification, where you have professionals or consultants like ourselves coming in to evaluate your systems and processes and making sure, and your data, and making sure that they meet at barest minimum regulatory requirements, and then other standards and frameworks that you have defined for yourself. And then another option is certification. So when it comes to certification, we are looking at ISO certification, for instance. We're looking at fair trade coming in to say that, oh yes, your supply chain, your whatever it is you're producing, your cocoa has been produced free of child labor. And then you have external stakeholder engagement, so that you understand their expectations. And then you make sure that whatever it is you are putting out, you're not going to massage figures, because that falls under the scope of greenwashing, which in some jurisdictions is actually considered criminal, when you come and lie about your sustainability progress or what you have done in terms of your sustainability. But when you understand stakeholder, stakeholder expectations, it helps you know how far off you are when it comes to your sustainability, meeting your goals and your targets. And then also, Andrew mentioned in his slide when he talked about the standards of framework that there are ratings and commercial organizations that do ESG scores and ratings and rankings. So once your company is subjected to that, a credible ESG score and rating company, it gives that integrity, or it further validates the data that you have put out there in respect of your sustainability metrics and targets. So that brings us to the end of the session. And before we take your questions, what I want to say is that I hope that, if nothing at all, we remember that incorporating or adopting ESG, it's a journey. It's not something that you wake up and do in a year. But what you need to do is to take that first step by planning for it. You should also understand the importance of collaboration. It's not something that you as a business can do in vacuum, or you can do in isolation. You'd have to engage with external third parties and stakeholders to make sure that, because at the end of the day, the objective of sustainability and ESG incorporation and adoption is to contribute towards a just and equitable society. So you need that collaboration to make sure that whatever it is you're doing factors all of those things in, because at the end of the day, if you have a sustainability strategy, or you go beyond strategy and even implement and achieve your goals, that doesn't answer societal and environmental needs, then you have wasted your time, you have wasted your resources, you have wasted everybody's time and energy. So those 2 points are very important. And then also, we need to keep at the back of our minds that your sustainability effort is supposed to drive positive societal impact and financial performance. And whilst we might be tempted to think that we have a choice as to whether we incorporate sustainability or ESG into our business, we should keep an eye on the external drivers that we refer to, so that if you're looking to do business with an organization, you might be required by extension to incorporate sustainability and ESG in operations. And an example of that will be if you're an organization going to access a loan from a bank, and that bank is required by its central government, its central bank, to incorporate sustainability in its operations. Then by extension, you will have to comply, because then the bank could refuse to make that facility available to you. So this brings us to the end of the session. We have 10 minutes more, so we can take questions from participants, or even comments and input. And then, yes, so whilst we are waiting for you to bring in your comments and questions, we have two more polls. We have 2 more poll questions that we want to launch. Okay, so I've gone back to the questions that I missed earlier on. So there's a question by Rachel asking which ESG standards and framework we would recommend for an SME starting the ESG journey. My answer is going to be, it depends. Because like I have said, that assessment is needed to understand the nature of business and potential uses of the ESG information. So if for instance you want to set your house in order to be able to access funding from an organization like IFC or AFDB, it will be very helpful for you to look at what they are asking for. So in determining whatever standard or framework, it's based on your circumstances. But and then also the nature of business. But the IFC performance standards would be a good place to start if you don't have a particular regulator or client or a business partner or investor in mind, and you want to do a general adoption of ESG. And then there's a question of Reha's question about the carbon market framework. So the carbon market framework comes in. Sorry, it comes in when we are looking at climate change. We are looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and I hope that the examples I gave regarding offsets and then reduced emissions answer the question. So when it comes to offsets, so the carbon the carbon markets come in when it comes to offsets. So you want to invest in an activity, in a mitigation adaptation activity that removes greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So I can't say the rules that pertain to other markets, but when it comes to Ghana, for instance, they have very, very specific rules when it comes to the kind of activity that can be considered for such engagements. So at the end of the day, yes, it fits into the E aspect of ESG, but it only applies to climate action and then greenhouse gas emissions. So it won't extend to pollution, it won't extend to energy management, it won't extend to water management, it won't extend to waste management. I hope that answers the question. Do we have any more questions? Okay, in the absence of any more questions, I will cede the microphone to okay, before I see it, I would want to announce the poll results, and I'm quite pleased to hear that 72% of you said you are very likely to incorporate sustainable practices in your businesses after this webinar. And then also 89% also said that all the pillars of ESG are important to their business. So that's good to hear. And Andrew and I, on behalf of Deloitte, wish you well. And if you have any questions and you need any help, don't feel threatened by our brand and think that it will be unaffordable. We usually have special provision for small scale businesses, because at the end of the day, like I said, the potential impact varies with the size of the business. So you can always reach out to us, Andrew and I, and we'll see how we can help you with your sustainability and ESG needs and requirements. So thank you very much, and I'm ceding the microphone to Fiona. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you to both you and Andrew for such an incredible session. I think there's quite a lot to take away, not only just on the startup or SME perspective, but also on a personal point of view and also personal perspective. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to have you both on board, and also to our participants for engaging with us on our polls and in the chat box, and for taking this time really to join us and listen and learn more about sustainability and ESG. One thing that has been asked on repeat is whether the presentation and the recording will be available. And yes, it will be available as soon as we do have it. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and the presentation will be shared on a follow-up email, on Monday. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Ms. Koney, and to the entire Deloitte team, and to our participants today for joining us. And ciao. Have a great evening.
Have a great evening too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.